So I don't know how many of you noticed this, but many of the children just skipped the greeting time to come up here and get a front row seat for the children's message. And if any of you are so inclined, the front row is almost always wide open. So if you want to skip and come forward and sit in the front row and claim those front row spots, you can have a spot at the church mosh pit too, in the front row. My grandma died this spring. She was 98 years old. She had lived an incredible long life and was pretty healthy until the past few years where she was mostly bedridden. She grew up an only child on her parents' farm in a very rural part of northeast Iowa, and she lived almost the entirety of her life within just a few miles of that spot. That's where she met my grandfather. They raised their family, and then it was only when she moved up to a senior living facility in the suburbs to be closer to my mom and her sister that she was there for the past 20 years or so. My grandma was a very opinionated woman. Both of my grandmothers were, now that I think about it. But one of the things that she told me, and I might have shared this with you once before, because it stuck with me, not in a good way, but she said to me when I was a teenager, or probably before I was a teenager, before I was old enough to start dating, she said, "I want you to know one thing about dating." And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be interesting. And she said, "Don't date an Irish girl." And I heard it, and I dismissed it immediately, because I knew that that was from some strange prejudice that she had been harboring for a very long time. And I'm guessing that in her childhood that was part of how she was instructed, and maybe that was a widely held belief in their small community that she was a part of. I don't know. I never went back to inquire about that because I didn't think it was worth inquiring about. It seemed kind of silly to me and wrong, and so I just didn't do that. And I had a crush on a girl named Molly O'Keefe for a while. Didn't tell Grandma about that one. But something interesting happened. So Grandma got really interested in genealogy. And you can see where this is going, right? She got interested in genealogy, and one of the things that she uncovered was that there was a distant relative who was Irish. And but when we asked her about that, she said, "I don't think that's right." She just said, the DNA is wrong. And so she sort of dismissed that. But the more interesting thing that happened was she, over the past 15 years, as she knew her life was winding down, she started to send my sister, who's also a pastor, she started to send my sister and I letters every couple of years with funeral wishes for herself. And then it was updates on those wishes. And so I think by the time she died, and I went back to look at the notes, she had listed over 30 hymns that she would like played or sung at her funerals, so we had to whittle that down quite a bit. But one of the other interesting things was, she said, "I want to include this other thing in my service, and it's the way that I want you to end the service." And it was what I guess most of us would refer to as the Irish blessing. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And she had a letter inside the letter that explained the wishes around the Irish blessing. And she says this. She said, "As I was doing my genealogical research, I always knew that part of my ancestors, my mom's family, was from Wales. And so several years back, I got to take a trip to Wales, and I got to stay with and meet one of my distant cousins there. And they were lovely, and they became pen pals over the years. But this Welshman had the audacity to marry a woman from across the way in Ireland. And this woman was so kind to my grandmother and so generous with her that those two became pen pals as well. And this woman sent my grandma a copy of the Irish blessing. You know, the May the Road Rise Up to Meet You, that one. She sent a copy of that, and it so left an imprint on my grandmother that that's how she wanted her funeral service to end. And so back in April, when we had the service, I told that story, and we shared that blessing to end the service. As soon as my grandmother had met that woman, I never heard her say anything disparaging about the Irish again. That one relationship seemed to change things for her. I said this before, and you may have heard me say it, but I guess in my, albeit limited experience of interacting with people in the years that I've been alive, I have felt, or I have observed, or heard very few circumstances or instances of somebody whose heart or mind was significantly changed because of data. But I know scores of people whose hearts and minds and opinions and views were changed because of relationships. They met somebody that introduced them to something different, a perspective that they hadn't considered before, maybe tearing down the walls of an old stereotype or a prejudice that they had harbored or inherited somewhere along the way. And that's absolutely what happened with my grandmother, and with other folks too along the way. But isn't that true for all of us? Isn't that true for all of us, that we thought a certain way about something, and then all of a sudden there was a relationship that somehow caused something that we had taken as a given or a fact, a truism, and it all of a sudden was thrown into question because things were a little bit different? Isn't it like Amanda was just talking to the kids about how it's not about the jersey that we wear, it's about what our hearts proclaim that will let people know about our values and who we love and who we worship and who we want to follow. The Jewish people take the laws of Moses very seriously. Throughout, if you read the scriptures and you read the Old Testament in particular, one of the defining moments in the story of the Jewish identity and culture is when they receive the law from Moses. When God sends Moses down Mount Sinai with the tablets, with the commandments, and then there's additional rules that go on, and then there's rules for rules, and then there's customs around the interpretation of rules that adds stuff that's not scriptural, but it's very much a part of the Jewish understanding of how we interpret the rules. And so all of these things that were handed down were so very, very important. And this is the culture, of course, that Jesus and his disciples are a part of. And there's the Ten Commandments, of course, absolutely are paramount in all of those rules and all of those laws. So imagine, if you will, the situation where you, as one of the 12 disciples, have dedicated your life for the past few years to following Jesus. And there was something very amazing about this man. He was so, he just had such an infectious personality. And the way that he taught things just opened up the scriptures in new ways. And you just found yourself drawn to him. And you pledged to him that you would follow him, and that you would follow him like apprentices follow a rabbi, and you would walk in his footsteps, and you would learn everything that you could from him in the precious time that you had with him. And so they followed him, and Jesus taught, and he shared, and he mentored. And then on the night before he was crucified, he met with his disciples, and they had a meal, and he said to them, "I have a new commandment for you." So we tell this story every year on Maundy Thursday, and we talk about how Maundy, it comes from the word mandate, like commandment, like a new commandment, a new Maundy. And on Maundy Thursday, we tell this story of Jesus and his disciples, and he says, "I have a new commandment for you." And we kind of gloss over that because we're familiar with the story at this point, but just consider for a minute what it would have been like to be a disciple, to grow up in that time period, to grow up in that culture, to understand that there are 10 rules above all others that you must follow, and then the man who has been leading you says, I have another one. I have an 11th commandment. Ooh, I bet your ears perk up. What is this? What standard are we being asked to uphold? And he says, the new commandment is this, that you love one another. Now, I don't know how many of you have considered this before, but of all the 10 commandments, the 11 commandments, I know which one I have the hardest time with. It's 11. Easy. Easy. And I'm guessing that it's the same for you. It is hard to love one another. And it is certainly hard to love one another like Jesus talks about loving one another. His whole ministry, the part that made him a hero and also really questionable, was the times that he would sort of step on the toes of normal conventional thinking around who was in and who was out, who was acceptable and who was unacceptable, who was touchable and untouchable, clean and unclean, pure, impure, that whole thing, right? And so the more that he does with that, the more that it sort of creates a lore around him, and people are fascinated by this. If you're one of the people that are being invited in, it's fantastic. And if you're one of the people that has felt pretty comfortable with your place in society, it feels kind of challenging. And you like the idea until it comes to actually where the rubber meets the road. Oh, sure, I'm on board with loving people. Yeah. Until it becomes hard. But he does this, and he's true to his word, and he's honoring what he says in his new commandment. He's trying to practice these things, and he's doing this in his ministry, in his teaching, in his service, in his prayers. This is how Jesus is living. And he is breaking down any kind of resentment, stereotypes, ancient grudges, all of that he's working to do away with. The past couple of weeks, we've been talking about this epidemic of loneliness, as the Surgeon General called it a few years ago. This idea that Americans, and really the Western world, but Americans in particular, are really struggling, feeling isolated, feeling like they have withdrawn, maybe in ways that they don't even fully understand. And all of us have, in some ways, been a part of this, right? We've all recognized that it's easier just to stay home instead of saying yes. There's all those times that, yeah, that sounds fun, but I'm not going to do it. Let me just throw one example out there for you. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm pointing fingers at all of you, but I'm also pointing a finger at me. But how many of us have gotten really crummy at RSVPs? Right? We wait until the last possible minute to make a commitment. Sometimes it's subconsciously thinking, well, maybe I'll just be busy and won't have the ability to do it. And sometimes we think, well, I want to control how many things I say yes to. And sometimes it's maybe a better option will come along for that time. But we wait until the last minute to say yes. And I think that is a part of us pulling back subconsciously. Why do we do it? I don't even know. But the idea of putting ourselves out there and saying yes, or agreeing to do something with other people, seems harder to do than it used to be. I shared a couple weeks ago, just the world for so many people now is I can work remotely, I can order my groceries in, I can order fresh food delivered from a taxi service. I don't have to know my neighbors. I don't have to interact with people. I don't have to go to the workplace. My kids can be homeschooled. We can learn off the computer. We can watch, on and on and on, right? But the negative side effect of this is that it's actually pulling us back. And what I think that we're seeing too is that when we become more and more isolated, it's also not a great leap to think that we are becoming more and more detached. And as we become more and more detached, and we think about my needs and what I want, then it's easier to turn a blind eye to others who are really hurting and those who are suffering. And it's just easier to say, I don't want to deal with that, or I'm not going to pay any attention to that, or, yeah, I know, but that's so far away, I'm not going to worry about that. And so we detach ourselves from things like that are happening in Sudan, or we detach ourselves from things that we see in Gaza and Palestine, and we detach ourselves from Russia and Ukraine, and we detach ourselves from what's happening in Birmingham. And it's just because we say, well, we need to preserve something of ourselves, or if I put myself out there for all that stuff, it's just going to wreck me. And maybe we've gotten a little emotionally soft. And for some people, that probably needs to happen for their own self-care. But I think that there's a lot of us that like the detachment because we just don't have to be burdened by that. But to me, that sure flies in the face of the 11th commandment, that when Jesus says, I've got hours with you left. Hours. And I want one thing to sink in now. I want you to hear this 11th commandment, that you love one another. That you love one another. There's a story that I heard from my wife. Eleanor and Amanda, our director of children's ministry, were both at a summer camp this summer. Amanda did multiple camps and did a fabulous job. Pat her on the back for that. One of the camps that she was at was an elementary school overnight camp up at Camp Simatonga. And something happened special that week. I mean, lots of things happened, but this was one that was observed. There's a little boy that came to camp. I'm going to call him Josh. And Josh is a little black boy that was adopted by a white family. And he came to a camp, and the churches that attend that camp and send their kids are mostly white families. And I don't know that anybody was trying to exclude Josh, but it was obvious to some of the adult leaders that Josh was not just in the mix with all the other kids. He just was having a little bit of trouble finding his way socially or feeling fully included. But Josh was a sweet kid, but was kind of on the sidelines a lot. Kind of quiet. There was another boy, I'll call him Ben. Ben is on the spectrum. And Ben came to camp very, very interested in other kids. But Ben likes to talk about airplanes. And mostly just airplanes. And so for a while, that's okay. But it becomes hard to talk about airplanes for a whole week. And one day, Ben and Josh and the camp were swimming. And for whatever reason, Ben got distracted. Ben misplaced them. Ben forgot them. But Ben did not put on his socks after they got out of the water. And so he put his wet, bare feet into his shoes. And he spent the rest of the day like that. Later that night before bedtime, they were doing their closing activities around the campfire, and they were singing their songs, and they were doing their closing prayer, and they were going to end the night with cooking out s'mores over the fire. And little Ben was sitting by himself on the log, and little Josh noticed him over there. Josh went over to Ben and said, "What's wrong? You look upset." Ben said, "My feet hurt." Josh said, "Let's have a look." He took Ben's shoes off, saw that they were covered in fresh blisters, painfully walking with wet feet through most of the day. And without saying a word, Josh sat down next to Ben, took off his shoes, took off his socks, knelt at Ben's feet, and put his socks onto Ben's feet, took his shoes and laced them up for him. And he said, I want you to have mine. This should feel better. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Sometimes it's as simple as being attuned to the needs of somebody right next to you. Sometimes it's a calling to address a much greater need and hurt in this world that you uniquely have the gifts and the connections to make happen. But more often than not, it's the simple act of kneeling before someone and saying, how may I serve you? Because you are in need, and I am a friend that's here to help. And Christians will not be recognized by the jersey that they wear or the t-shirt that proclaims who they are, but they will be known by what is in their heart and the way that you love one another. Will you pray with me?